Okay, so last day of the conference, 8:30 in the morning. You guys made it. I appreciate that you guys came. Welcome to DBI 302, Building Stylish Power View Reports. My name is Ricardo Muti. I'm a program manager on the SQL Server Reporting Services team. That's the same team that builds Power View as well as all the other reporting services features and components. The area that I focus on is the reporting services engine, the engine that's actually at the core of reporting services that powers traditional reporting services reports as well as Power View reports. So everything having to do with the file format, the RDL file format, querying different types of data sources, pulling in the data, processing the data, doing all sorts of calculations and expressions, rendering to the screen, rendering to different output formats. I have focused quite a lot on the last release on Power View, almost exclusively on Power View over the last release, and have worked on a number of the features that I'm going to be showing you today. So if you have any questions about those, hopefully I'll be able to answer them today. Session is called Building Stylish Power View Reports. We are going to build some stylish-looking Power View visualizations, but this is in the broader scope of taking a deep dive into Power View, giving you a demo of a lot of the features, and explaining to you, kind of giving you a little bit of background on where Power View came from, why we did it, who we're targeting it at, why it behaves the way it behaves, and how you can influence the behavior of Power View. So this really is a session for you to get a deep dive of Power View. If you're interested in Power View and how it works and why it works the way it works, hopefully you'll find this session valuable. There are some other sessions that I think might also be of interest to you that I'll point out at the end of the session. My contact information is up there, so after the session, if you have any questions or can't find the answer to something online, you can reach out to me in these ways. You can go to my blog, my MSDN blog. If you want to see a really empty blog, you will be rewarded. You can email me at ricardo.muti@microsoft.com, and I can try and get your answer to the right person. Or you can check me out on Twitter. Speaking of Twitter, can you guys raise your hands if you went to the keynote, the first keynote on Tuesday, and saw the Power View demo? Okay, most of you. Great. So you guys will have already seen, most of you anyways, a quick demo of Power View, so we're going to dive much deeper into it today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you an introduction to Power View. Again, not so much what it is, because you've seen it already, but what the goal was. What gap is it filling, or what scenario is it addressing? Why did we create it? Who is it aimed at? Then take a deep dive into Power View and its features. We're going to do that in the form of demos and do it by example. We're going to spend a good chunk of the session doing demos in the product. And then finally, at the end, we're going to go into this section called Revealing the Magic, where we're going to show you some of the things that sort of seem perhaps arbitrary or seems like magic, or you wonder, why did Power View do that, or how did it decide to do that? A lot of it is driven by the model and driven by the model design. So we're going to switch focus a little bit and look at the model and show you the settings that you can set to influence the behavior of Power View. There are some other sessions that will go even deeper to that. So like I said, I'll refer you to some of those sessions at the end if you want to learn even more about that. So starting off, just giving you the intro of Power View. Power View is part of reporting services. So what I want to emphasize is it's one of the investments that we made in reporting services in SQL Server 2012. And taking that even broader to SQL Server BI, spanning reporting services and analysis services, we've been executing on this roadmap of managed self-service BI. What that means is we want to put, we want to expand the reach of BI to audiences that haven't had access to it before because it was too hard or too complicated. You know, typically somebody, there are a lot of users of information workers in companies that have enough technical sophistication and enough basic computer skills that they can use Excel. They can maybe use a pivot table, but they would have no hope of building a cube. So, and even building a report in, for example, Report Designer or even Report Builder might be too complicated for them. So we're trying to lower the bar of entry of BI so that it's available to the masses and it's accessible to the masses. So that's what we mean by self-service BI. It doesn't mean that it replaces professional BI, because there will always be degrees of complexity, and models and reports will always range in complexity, and towards the complex end and the high scale end, you'll always need professional software and professional report designers and professional model designers. But definitely we want to have this spectrum of information workers being able to create their own models and their own reports alongside professionals who have always been able to do so. But the other half of that is we don't want to put more power in the hands of information workers only to create a disaster for IT. So that's where the managed comes in. We made investments in making reporting services and analysis services more easily manageable and more easy to manage and more easy to administer, even when that means monitoring and managing the self-service BI artifacts. So some examples of that, I'll actually start from the right side here. When it mentions enabling reporting services as a SharePoint shared service, reporting services has had SharePoint integration since SQL Server 2005. However, that integration was not complete. It was at the UI level mostly. So we had a reporting services add-in for SharePoint that would, you would have your reports synced to SharePoint document libraries. You could run the reports within the SharePoint UI. But the actual report server and the actual report execution was happening in a Windows service outside of SharePoint. And so unlike other SharePoint services like Excel services or Power Pivot where you could go to SharePoint Central Admin and manage it, you couldn't do that with reporting services. You had to use a separate config tool, and so it was not completely integrated. In this release, what we've done is we've rewrote the report server as a SharePoint service application. So it actually runs inside SharePoint just like Excel services, just like Power Pivot. And so now you manage it the same way you manage those other services in the same place in SharePoint Central Admin. The deeper integration with SharePoint also brings a lot of additional benefits. For example, scale out. There's no longer, you no longer have to learn some proprietary way that reporting services does scale out. Scale out is just a generic service of SharePoint. It's got a built-in load balancer for the app service. So you do load balancing the way you load balance on any other SharePoint service. Backup recovery, logging, tracing and logging, claims authentication, these things all are done in the standard SharePoint way. Another investment that we did was what we call end-user alerting, or what you'll sometimes hear referred to as data alerts. So the idea behind this is rather than me going and rendering a report on a daily basis or checking a report on a daily basis or even getting a subscription but not necessarily knowing whether anything important happened that day or whether there's any action item for me, we can do reporting sort of by exception or by event. I can go to a report, and this is on top of existing reporting services reports, and I can say when this value, when any of these values dips below some threshold, we can define any sort of different types of rules, but this is just one example. When this value dips below 90%, shoot me an email and give me in the email the exact value that triggered this alert. And that's the data alert capability that we built. And this is all self-service as well. IT doesn't have to create these alerts for people. People can go and just create them for themselves. And then finally, the focus of this session is PowerView. And we'll talk about what that is. So what is PowerView? PowerView is a new type of experience that we've introduced in reporting services alongside the stuff that's already there. But it's aimed at a little bit of a different scenario and a little bit of a different target audience than we have aimed at in the past. So reporting services dates back to 2003, 2004, and it was really about, well, for one thing, competing with Crystal Reports and those sorts of tools that were very much derived from what we think of as traditional reporting. It's very much like the electronic version of the paper reports that we're all used to. And granted, when you move it into the on-screen space and the software space, you have a little bit of interactivity. You want to take advantage of that, so you have sorting, and you have filtering, and you have parameters. But it's very much a workflow of I go to some report, I pass in some values, I say generate or execute or render or whatever, and then it spits out a report, spits out some output, right? And it's very well suited because it's got that traditional sort of page layout to exporting to different formats like PDF or even printing it. The target audience for that also was one of fairly high technical sophistication. People who know how to construct a connection string, how to write a SQL query, or how to write an MDX query. Initially, reporting services was only in Visual Studio. We didn't even have Report Builder. So that's the sort of the origins of reporting services. PowerView is aimed at a little bit of a different scenario, where we're not so much concerned with the electronic equivalent of a traditional report. We're not so much concerned with exporting to PDF. This is not maybe the ideal thing to produce a PDF. If my singular goal were to produce a PDF, I would probably use the traditional reporting services stuff. If my highest priority was beautiful printed reports, really pixel-perfect printed reports, also not really the primary objective here. Primary objective here is beautiful, stunning data visualizations with rich interactivity optimized for on-screen consumption. And then the target audience is the information worker, somebody who doesn't necessarily know how to construct a connection string or write a query or write VB.NET expressions. So you're not going to see any of that in the product. Now, it doesn't mean that this platform isn't going to evolve and that in the future you won't see more professional or advanced mode features of Power View. But definitely the focus of this release is a really, really simple data visualization tool for information workers. So we want things to be really easy to do, to be able to create data visualizations from scratch and make it something that is presentation ready in just a few clicks. We have different types of data visualizations, and you can easily convert among them. It runs in SharePoint, so to share this with your coworkers, you do that through SharePoint, and it's got some presentation features built right in because we want these reports to be presentation ready and for you at a moment's notice to say, I'm ready to present this to somebody and it looks great. It runs in the browser. It is cross-platform, cross-browser. We support IE on Windows, Firefox on Windows, Safari on Mac, and it is integrated into SharePoint Server. And a lot of the manageability, for example, managing security to reports and permissions to reports, is the same as managing permissions to any other SharePoint document. So again, very symmetric with the way you manage anything else in SharePoint. Just some of the pillars of Power View. We call it a highly visual design experience. So it's this web-based authoring tool. It's got a really easy-to-use, familiar Microsoft Office sort of look and feel. It looks very much like Office web apps if you use that because those are running in the browser as well. We've got all sorts of different types of data visualizations beyond just the standard tables and charts that you have in Excel, and we'll show some examples of those. The other thing is that a lot of what we wanted to do in Power View, to do that rich interactivity, we wanted it to just be automatic. We wanted it to just work without you having to hook up a whole bunch of stuff. And we wanted things to just look good by default and kind of show the right thing by default. The way we're able to achieve all that is that we made a big bet on a BI semantic model with a whole bunch of rich metadata in it. So this is another contrast to traditional reporting services. In traditional reporting services, you can connect to analysis services, but you can also connect to SQL Relational or Oracle or XML or SharePoint list. We have a whole bunch of different data extensions, and we connect directly to them with nothing in between. There's no modeling layer in between. With Power View, we made a big bet on analysis services. And analysis services built partially in 2008 R2 with Power Pivot, and then completing that vision in 2012, something called a BI semantic model, which is sort of the next generation of the unified dimensional model, the UDM. And it's this new model that has two flavors, multidimensional, which is sort of the cubes that we're all used to, and then tabular models, which are a little bit easier to understand and easier to create. So at the moment, the data source for Power View reports is those tabular models. They can be either embedded in Excel workbooks, or they can be standalone analysis services databases. But that's the only thing that we query directly. And we defer the responsibility of pulling in data from a whole bunch of different data sources to analysis services and to that model. So we have this sort of modeling layer in between. And then by all means, you can pull in data from OData, from the web, from SQL, from Oracle, whatever, into your analysis services model. Presentation ready at all times. I mentioned that again. We didn't want users to have to, spend some time getting the right data and the right results in their report, but then seeing a very boring, very ugly-looking table or ugly-looking chart, and then having to fuss around with it and fuss around with the formatting for a long time just to get it so that it looks decent and looks presentable. So we just wanted things to look presentable by default. And then presentation was a big aspect of this. Once you've discovered some insights, you want to share those with others and you want to present them to others. So Power View reports in and of themselves should make for great presentations. And if you have other types of presentations, we should be able to merge that BI content in there as well. Another thing I'll mention is that, again, we're trying to target a lower target audience than we have before. We're trying to get this to be so simple to use that information workers can use it. And that's not something that we can completely claim that we've really achieve today with, say, Report Builder. Report Builder, when we introduced it, is certainly a lot easier to use than Visual Studio. And for those who don't need the Visual Studio shell or source control, it does help. It is more lightweight. It is easier to use. But it's still not something that most information workers are comfortable using or find really easy to use. It needs to be even simpler than that. In order to achieve that, we had to kind of restrain ourselves because Report Builder has pretty much every report design feature, or 95% of them that we have in Visual Studio. The cost of that is complexity, and there's a whole bunch of features in there that 99% of users never use. So better to have, the less is more, better to have fewer features, but have whatever we have in the product be really usable. At least for the target audience that we're targeting now, that is more important. So some of the design principles that we set for ourselves and that we have plastered all around our offices so that we're always reminded of them are shown up here. And I'll just comment on a few of them. 2 clicks to return on investment. That means that for any sort of basic task, basic atomic operation that you want to do in Power View, it should be 1 or 2 clicks. It shouldn't be a string of 4, 5, 6 clicks. And an example of that would be that you will not find any property windows or property dialogues or wizards or anything like that in Power View. Generally, you do things either in the ribbon with 1 or 2 clicks, or you do them in the field list with 1 or 2 clicks. Most things are done that way. That's different from Report Builder, for example. Everything happens on the canvas with the data. If anybody went to my session yesterday giving you tips and tricks of how to build traditional reporting services reports, you might have noticed that I switch back and forth a lot between design mode and preview mode. Because in design mode, you see the template of your table or the template of your chart, and you see the field references and you see expressions, but you don't see the actual data. So you often have to go and preview to keep getting a sense of what your report looks like with the actual data. With Power View, there is absolutely no distinction between designing a report and rendering a report. Whenever you're designing it, you're rendering it. So when you design it on the design surface, you're querying and you're getting the actual data and you're seeing the actual data. Choose the right default by default. Power View is not always automatically going to do exactly what you want, but we very often do something that's in general the most logical next thing to do. And we do that based on just general logic as well as metadata in the model. And you'll see some examples of that. Highly performant and efficient. In traditional reporting services, the onus is sort of on the report developer to be sensible in the data that they're pulling into the report. So if I'm writing the query myself in Report Builder, and I need to know whether I'm pulling in 1,000 rows, 1,000,000 rows, 1,000,000,000 rows, and I probably should not be pulling in 1,000,000,000 rows because that report's going to take forever. So I need to kind of be responsible myself for pulling in the subset or the slice of the data that I really need. In Power View, that's not true. The Power View just hooks up directly to the model, and the user does not write queries. There's no report designer who writes queries. Power View generates the queries based on the shape of the data that a user has created or asked for. And what we do is we execute a query, and we execute a paged or segmented query. So even if there are 1 billion rows in the database, we say, get us the first 100, or get us the first 50, or whatever it is. And then you'll go and scroll, for example, in a tablix, and when you hit the bottom or near the bottom, we'll automatically go and fetch the next segment for you. So you don't have to worry about Power View ever pulling down 1 billion rows. It's never going to do that. There are a whole bunch of features in Power View. Even though it is a V1, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we got into the first release, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that we continued working on even after we finished the first release. And before it was even shipped, we're already working on the next batch of features, but there's a ton already in V1. So I thought what we'd do is go through them one by one and talk to them, each of them for about 10 minutes. And of course, I'm kidding. I'm not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to do a demo. So let's go to Power View here. Probably the most essential thing is how do you actually launch Power View? So again, I mentioned that the data source for Power View is a BI semantic model, a tabular model. And that could be a workbook, an Excel workbook, or a Power Pivot workbook, or it could be an analysis services tabular database. So if I had a workbook, I could publish that up to SharePoint. And in SharePoint, if you've installed Power Pivot for SharePoint, you'll have the Power Pivot gallery, which is a nice visual way of browsing your workbooks. So here I have a bunch of workbooks in here. And here, for example, I've got a workbook that I got some healthcare data, some medical research data from Windows Azure Data Market that's got a whole bunch of interesting data on patients who visited doctors or hospitals or clinics in the United States and all the clinical data and vitals that they collected along with that. Really interesting data. Pulled it into a Power Pivot workbook, published it up here. I could launch Power View just from the Power Pivot gallery by clicking on this button that says Create Power View Report. The other thing, though, the other scenario might be, though, that I have a larger, more enterprise-class analysis services database. And for that, I need some sort of entry point in SharePoint to go and launch Power View from that, so some sort of connection file. Now, reporting services has had for quite some time shared data sources. So you can create a reporting services shared data source. And we've also introduced in this release the analysis services BI semantic model connection file. So here I can create a BI semantic model connection, and it's specific to analysis services. I can just connect directly to an analysis services database. So the way to create these, for example, I can create a BI semantic model connection. And then you just give it a file name, so I can call it healthcare. And then this could point to a workbook, but really you probably wouldn't create a BI semantic model connection just to connect to a workbook, because you could just launch directly from the workbook. So probably this is going to be basically the two typical elements of a connection string: the server name, or the server and instance name. So this could be like server, instance, and then the database name. So the database could be called healthcare, for example. Right? And that's it. That's all there is to creating a BI semantic model connection. Reporting services shared data sources have predated all this stuff, and we still support them for backwards compatibility. And they are not specific to analysis services, right? So if I create a report data source, you'll see a bunch more options. I'll give it a name, call it healthcare. But I have a choice of different types of data sources, right? These are all the ones that we support in reporting services. So there's the pre-existing SQL Server analysis services data source type, but we also have a new one specifically for Power View. And to launch Power View from a shared data source, that's the one you have to choose, this BI semantic model for Power View. And then the connection string would just be a typical analysis services connection string. The interesting additional option that you have here when you use an RSDS file is that you have different options for how you authenticate to the data source. So I could use Windows Integrated Authentication, which is going to take the authenticated SharePoint user and try and delegate their identity to the analysis services database. In order to do that, you will probably need Kerberos. So one alternative to that is stored credentials. We don't support prompted credentials for Power View. We don't support no credentials either. You will always need to authenticate to analysis services. So the other option is really stored credentials. And here I could put in the username and password of a Windows user, and we're just going to connect to analysis services as that user. So now that I've created some of these connection files, to launch Power View from an RSDS, I can just click on this and say Create Power View Report. Or I could do the same from a BISM file. It's got a similar option, Create Power View Report. But with the BISM file, it's even easier. I can actually just click on this thing, but the default action for it is to launch Power View. So I click on this, and we're going to have Power View up here in a second. So this is Power View, right? And let's just take stock for a second of what we have here. So it's a web-based application. It's running in the browser. I didn't have to install anything. It's got a very Office-like look and feel. You can see the ribbon that I have at the top here. That's one area of the shell where we're going to be doing a lot of work. The other one here is the field list on the right side. So what that represents is the semantic model itself, the tables and columns and measures in the semantic model. If we were to connect to the same model using Excel and creating a pivot table, for example, you would see a similar looking field list. So a nice feature actually is I can hover over these things and get a description. This is some of the model metadata. So when you're building a model, you can put that metadata in, and it will show up here so people can see an explanation. Like I wouldn't have known what a chart is, but by a chart, they're referring to a medical chart. So it's the patient's vitals and all that information that they took in when they made a visit. So here, it's always good to give our report a title. So we'll call this Table and Matrix. Just going to make this a bit bigger. Because the first thing we're going to do is focus on tables and matrices, which are really the most basic data visualizations. By the way, you can insert any text box anywhere you want. If you want to add just any static text, so here I can say, this is a subtitle. I'll make that a lot bigger. And it's rich text, so you can, set different fonts for this stuff, for different parts, different text runs within the text box. So you can put those wherever you want. To create a table, one of the easiest ways is I just take one of the tables here. It's got a bunch of columns and measures and stuff inside it, but I can just click on the table, and what it's going to do is just create a default table for that table in the model. Just give it a sec. There we go. And if I expand this, what you'll notice is that it checks some fields and not others. So it may seem kind of arbitrary. Why did it pick these fields? Well, this is an example of model metadata. So the model designer has specified or has decided that these fields are the ones that we should add by default whenever we haven't specified particular fields. We've just said we want some fields from this table. This is where it starts us off. We're free to, of course, remove them and add some more, but this is what it chooses by default because it deems that they're a more interesting subset. So you might be curious what some of these icons mean in the field list, right? So you see a bunch of different icons, calculators, sigma signs, this little card-looking thing. This card-looking thing, if I zoom in on that, indicates that that is a key for the table, or it's something that's going to create a details group for the table because it groups on the key. So to give you an example, right, if I choose something like physician specialty from the chart, this table has hundreds of thousands of rows. Clearly, here I do not have hundreds of thousands of rows. I just have the distinct values for this column, the physician specialty. So this is not a details group. It's not grouping on the key. Whereas if I add something like chart ID, which is grouping on the key, in fact, it is the key in this case, query is going to take a little bit longer, but it's going to return one row for literally every row in the database. And you'll see it also here in the field list that you've got that details group icon. So that's when you know you've got a details group. This sigma icon here, you'll see that sometimes on numeric fields. What it means is that when when it's ambiguous, whether we should be grouping by the individual values, the individual distinct values of that field, or whether we should be aggregating them together by summing them or averaging them or something, when it's not clear which one we should do, if you have a sigma sign next to it, it means that the default aggregate has been specified, so it will aggregate by something. If there is none there, then it won't aggregate, it'll actually group on it. So to show you the difference, let's say I take region. So I'll take the region name. These are regions of the United States. And if I take blood pressure here, this is a decimal value. There's a whole bunch of, there's going to be hundreds and thousands of distinct values of blood pressure. It's not going to show me all of them. It's going to aggregate them for the group that I already have, which is region. So it's grouping on them, right? And you'll see that it chose to do average. You'll see that as well in the field list over here, that it did average. And I can change it, have a bunch of other options, sum, min, max, or even do not summarize, which would actually group on those values. The reason it chose average, which is correct, because summing blood pressure doesn't really make a lot of sense, so averaging them out makes more sense. The reason it did that is because, again, of the model metadata. The model said it makes most sense to average this field, not sum it. Sum is the default in many cases for a decimal field. So if you contrast that with something like, let's take patient age. Patient age is a numeric field as well, but it's set to do not summarize. So if I pull this in, just by default, it's not going to average the age. It's going to give me all the ages. Now, again, these are all just defaults that's specified in the model, so I can override this and I can say, no, average it. And now we get the average age. By the way, it looks like the model designer in this case didn't really set a nice number formatting for these, so we can do that. I can just click in the cell here, go to the Home tab, and much like the ribbon group in Excel, it looks very similar. I can change this and say format it as a number, maybe get rid of a few more decimal places, and there you go. Now you've got a nicer formatted number. So let's look at grouping in tables and matrices. Let's grab the region again, and then let's grab the the number of charts. I want to know how many visits to the doctor were there for each of these regions. Luckily, the model designer has included a measure. By the way, a measure, sorry, with this calculator icon, forgot to mention this. A measure is, if I just add this, you'll see. A measure is like a aggregated field that we showed before, except it's not a column at all. It's not a column in the table. It's simply a formula or a calculation, and so you can't group by it. It will always be aggregated. The aggregate is kind of built into the formula. It's simply a formula that's evaluated in whatever scope you put it in. So I can't change the aggregate here. So here I've got the number of charts. If the model designer didn't have that foresight to include this number of charts thing because he didn't know I wanted to count the number of charts, I could still count the number of charts without that measure because I can take any field here and I can say add it, but add it as a count. So I'm going to add this chart ID, so it's just going to count up the distinct IDs. And now I got the same values. Okay. So you can see there, for each region, I've got the number of visits to the doctor. Yes?
When you chose the calculated measure,
yeah.
There was an extra row in the output with a blank region name and the count of 0. And
Yeah.
that doesn't appear now. Why is that difference?
So I suspect, if I do something here, that is a good question. I'm trying to remember how I constructed that measure. I will have to get back to you on that. Okay, so I've got this table here, and what I want to do is I want to pull in an additional level of grouping. So let's say I want not only the regions, but the states within the region. So I'm going to pull state into here. Now, that might not have been what you would have expected, because you're seeing the region repeated a lot. And the reason that is because by default, whenever you create anything in PowerView, we start with this visualization called a table. And a table, in this case, the terminology means a flat table. It's got no blocked grouping structure or stepped grouping structure or anything like that. It's simply a flat list, sort of like a spreadsheet. In order to get a block structure, what I would do is I would convert this to a matrix. And then by default, you get a block structure. So now you'll see that you get Midwest, only once, and it's got this spanning cell. Now I can pull in something else. I can pull in, let's say, the year of the visit, and I can actually put this, instead of putting it on row groups, I can put it on column groups, and then I'll get a true matrix. And by the way, a little trick is if you take the edge of a table or matrix and you double-click it, it will auto-size it so that it fits the content. So here you can see that I've got regions and states on the rows, and then I've got years on the columns. And by default, it adds subtotals on both the rows and the columns. I can change that option from totals up here. So I could say I don't want any at all, or maybe I want them only on the columns. So you have that option to change that. So that pretty much covers tables and matrices. Now, a report, this is sort of one view in my report, right? This canvas, and it looks kind of like a PowerPoint slide. I can have multiple of these views in my report. And much like PowerPoint, I can just say new view. It's analogous to new slide. And you can see that I have a second slide here. And I'm going to collapse this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say charts, and we'll focus on charts for a bit. So let's take division name. So division is a sub-geography of a region. And then let's take the average blood pressure. This is another one where I set the default to be the average. And then I'm going to convert that to a column chart. It's very easy to take any table or anything and then just with one click convert to some other visualization. If you open up this gallery, you'll see all the other options. I'm going to convert this to a column chart. And there we go. We've got a column chart. Now, if I go down to the patient, I notice I also have their gender. I wonder what happens if I just check gender. So I'm not going to drag it to somewhere explicit. I'm just going to check it. And what happens is PowerView just uses some default behavior to say, where's the next logical field well drop bucket where I should put this? And here we only had a category group, and we weren't using the series group, so we decided that maybe we should create series on that. So in this particular case, I'm looking at the average of the blood pressure. I don't want to stack these up. That's what it does by default, is it creates a stack chart. But I can also switch that to a clustered column chart. So just switch that, because what I want to do actually in this case is compare the averages between men and women. So there you can see that. Now, one of the questions we get very often as soon as we show a chart is, can I change the colors for the chart? For the longest time you couldn't, and it wasn't planned for this release, but at the last minute we squeezed in a really, really simplistic feature. We're building on it for the next release, but for this release, you can go to Styles, and you can just kind of toggle or rotate the accent colors. So then you've got some built-in ones that you can switch. Okay. Hopefully you find one that you find pleasing enough. The other options available with chart are, I can there's an automatic chart title. It's not an editable chart title. It's just generated based on what the current fields are. But I can turn it off. I can move the legend around or turn it off completely, so I can move this to the bottom, for example. I can turn the data labels on and off, so I can have data labels inside my bars if I want to see the actual values. So, and that's an example of a basic chart, right? There are other types of charts. I could do line charts as well. Scatter charts, which we'll show a little bit later. So, but that's sort of the basics. I'm going to create a new view. Let's dig a little bit deeper into some more advanced visualizations. So here I want to look at doctor visits, diagnoses, and prescriptions. Okay. And I'm going to look at this by age. So if I were to open a hospital tomorrow, what sort of distribution of patients' ages would I see coming into the hospital? So I'll check age. And remember, by default, it's going to group on age. And then I'm going to grab the count of the charts. And then I'm going to convert that to a line chart. Here, the reason I'm using a line chart is because I could have used a column chart. But the general guidance here is the thing at the bottom is a sequence. It's a quantitative axis. There's a sequence there. It's a continuous axis. You know, there's even a logical sequence here because people get older. They age along this axis, so they progress along this axis. So it makes sense to have a numeric quantitative axis here, and that's why we use a line chart. Even with a column chart, you have the option of switching the type of axis between categorical, which is what it does by default for a column chart, or you can use a continuous axis, which will create a sort of histogram. So you could have done that as well. But honestly, for this type of chart, the best choice is probably a line chart. So I'm going to make it a line chart. And then, just like I did before, I'm going to pull in the gender. I'm not going to tell it where to put it, but it's going to put it on series, because that sort of makes sense. And you can see that if I were to open that hospital that I mentioned, we wouldn't see a ton of people in their 20s. We wouldn't see that many people in their 80s or 90s, because not everybody lives that old. And we'd see a lot of people middle-aged. And the other interesting thing is that there's this huge spike at around, 57 years old. And for some reason, it's only for females. There is no spike at all for males. So it would be interesting to dig in and see why that is. Instead of looking at gender, so here what we've done is look at the structure of this chart. We've got a category axis on age, and then we've got a series group on gender, which is another field. And then you've got one measure, which is count of chart. What if instead of having a series group, I wanted to put multiple measures? I didn't want to count just charts, but I wanted to count something else as well and compare them. So people are going to the doctor. Sometimes you go to the doctor, you get diagnosed with something. Other times you just go home and they give you a clean bill of health. So maybe I can count the diagnoses as well. So there you go. Now I've got two measures. See, I've got two measures in my values field well here. And I've got nothing in my series. So in here you can see another insight, right? When you're younger, there's this gap in between the visits and the diagnoses. So lots of times you go to the doctor and they say there's nothing wrong with you. Whereas when you get older, you're not really giving the doctor much of a challenge to find something wrong with you anymore. So we can add another one here. We can add as many measures as we want. I wouldn't go overboard because at some point it's going to become unreadable and there's probably a better choice. But we can add a third one. We can add prescriptions and see how many times did the doctor prescribe something for that diagnosis. Okay. Now, Everything I've done so far, I could have done in Excel with an Excel chart. I mentioned before that we can go beyond Excel, and we're going to continue going beyond Excel, I think, in future releases with all sorts of cool visualizations. But here's one example. What if I wanted to add yet another dimension of grouping here? What if I also wanted to see how this trend was different across different regions of the United States? Here I can grab, for example, region name. What is it supposed to do with that? Because I've already got 3 measures. So I'm already using the legend. I'm already using both axes. What is it going to do? It does something pretty cool. It creates what we call small multiples. I'm just going to zoom this down a bit so you can see it better. And small multiples are really great for seeing the trend in different values of a group, right? So the axes are all aligned and everything. And here I can see another insight, right? This visualization was very effective at showing to me that spike is only in the western region of the United States. Again, for what reason, I don't know. We would have to drill into that. But it's a really effective visualization for comparing the trend all at once for different values of a group. So let's create a new view. We've talked a lot about diagnoses and prescriptions and visits to the doctor. Not being really a medical expert, I might be curious, what are they getting diagnosed with? What different types of diseases or diagnoses are there? So let's create a new view in our report. And as it happens, in this model, I've got a table here called ICD-9 disease, which stands for the International Statistical Classification of Diseases. So there's a standard classification of these diseases. If I just click on this table, I'm going to get the default fields. And look at that. This one even includes an image. And I would highly recommend looking into images and how they work in Power View because they can really, really spice up a report and make it more fun to interact with and just more easy to interact with because your eyes are drawn to the differences between these pictures. Imagine that you could use these for logos, you could use these for products, anything. They're really, really useful. And I'll show you a couple of ways of how you can get that into your model. Now, tables can be really useful. We previously showed a table where we're using the table to group things into different scopes by rows and by columns. Here, this is pretty much just a list. I just wanted to peruse the list. So another visualization that you might consider is called a card. And I can convert this to a card, and you get this sort of view, which is great for just looking at a list of things. Now, I'm curious which of these types of diseases are more common than others. So I'm going to pull, there are a couple fields that I don't want here. I can remove them or I can just actually just drag them away. So I'm going to drag them out here. And the thing that I do want is I want to count the frequency of these diagnoses. So let's go up to the diagnosis entity and say add the diagnosis ID as a count. And then we're going to add that in there. Now, notice that it added that in the body of this table. It says this little field. Why did it do that? Whereas, with the title here, it knew to put that as the title of the card, and it knew to align this image to the left nicely. That's something we call the default label and the default image. So in the model, you can say what is the default label for a table and what is the default image, and you'll see that have an effect in this and other visualizations. So here, for example, it aligns it nicely and uses it as a nice big label for each of the cards. So now I've got the counts, but really now I'm looking at frequency. I'm not just perusing the list anymore. A better visualization for comparing the frequency here would probably be some sort of chart. And I can convert this very easily to a bar chart. And I mean, that looks absolutely nothing like the previous visualization that I had. So the conversions among visualizations can be quite radical, right? This is a totally different structure than what we had before. I can sort a chart just by going up to the top here and saying, I want to sort by the count, and I want to sort it descending, and now I can see what the most common diseases are. Yep.
Is it possible to add a small thumbnail of the picture to the chart?
No, unfortunately, we don't support pictures in charts right now. So now I'm going to build out this analysis here. Let's create another chart. I'm going to add the gender, and then let's add these count of the diagnoses, make it a bar chart. Just going to zoom this out for a sec because it's I need a little bit more space for this case. I move this down a bit. And I can add another chart for age group. I actually bucketed patients by age, and then we'll count up their number of diagnoses as well. And we'll make that one a column chart. Now, we just showed a card before. There's actually another style of card that I want to show you. So let's say you just have some key metrics. So for example, I'm interested in blood pressure, right? So I can grab the systolic blood pressure, the diastolic blood pressure. By default, it's a table. I'm going to convert it to a card. And it's going to look like the other card with that sort of blue outline. But the other style is I can check this and I can say callout. It's really good for just showing big, nice text values. These are not formatted very nicely. So what I'm going to do is change the number format. We'll just click on it again, make it a number, make this one a number as well. There you go. Now here's the beautiful thing about the semantic model. We know how all these things are interrelated. So in a lot of competitive products, what you'd have to do at this point if you wanted to add interactivity is you'd have to add some action on this column, this series or something that says, when I click on this column, go and filter this and highlight that. In Power View, we just have a lot of default behavior, and this stuff just works because we know how everything is interrelated. So just by clicking on females, for example, it's going to cross-highlight these other charts, and I didn't have to hook that up at all. The other thing you'll notice is that as I go through these age groups, for example, those key metrics at the top are changing. So it's showing right now the key metrics for the, 19 to 45 age group, right? Let's give that a sec. There we go. So those are a really good way of just having key metrics jump out at you. But the interactivity is really cool here. So, yes? No, so right now we don't have the ability for you to opt out of this interactivity. So I think in the future we'll probably be looking at you being a little bit more control into saying, what should this highlight something else? Should it filter something else? Or should it do nothing, maybe? So. Okay, so I couldn't do it by control clicking across two different charts, but what I could do is I could add a series group here. So here I could add a series group for gender. And then I would get a stack for males and a stack for females, and I could say, for example, males 50 to 64. Okay. Let's add another view. So I want to show you another visualization. Here, I'm going to take those diseases again. And then I'm going to click this button called Tiles. This creates a pretty cool visualization. It creates a container, unlike the other visualizations. Let me zoom this out here so you can see it a little bit better. So it creates this container, and it's got this navigation strip at the top. I'm going to delete the table that it left inside. Whatever I put inside is going to be scoped to whatever is selected above. So it's a great way of navigating through a group or some sort of dimension and seeing how that dimension affects the trends or values inside. So I'm going to pick the patient age, and I'm going to pick the counts of the diagnoses. And I'll bring in the gender again, and I'll make it a line chart, similar to the chart I created before. I got this all running on a laptop, SharePoint, reporting services, analysis services, and everything, so it gets a little bogged down sometimes. But you can see that I have a really good way now of navigating through these different types of diseases and seeing what the trend looks like for each of them. It's scoped to each of them, right? So heart disease, for example, is a big one of interest, right? Or I could compare that with diseases of the nervous system, for example. Now, one thing you may notice is that the axis, the vertical axis, is not synchronized across these things. So here, diseases of the nervous system are more rare. This only goes up to 70 in the sample data that we have. For the circulatory system, heart disease is very common, and it goes up to 200. So they're not synced. Now, that may be fine. And in often case with this sort of visualization, it is what I want. That's why it's the default. I'm more interested in looking at each of these one by one and just looking at what the trend looks like inside of it. I'm not so much comparing heart disease with diseases of the nervous system in terms of magnitude. I'm comparing it in terms of trend, if anything. So I can change that, though. That's just the default. What I could do, if this applies to a chart inside of a tile, is I can say the axes should either be adjusted for each tile or they should be the same across all tiles. The one that I wanted to sync is the vertical axis, and if I sync that, you're going to see that this is going to shrink a little bit. Okay. But then the downside of that is that some of them, it's harder to see the trend because they've been collapsed so much. So you may or may not want that depending on the data. One thing I can do, just like in PowerPoint how I can duplicate a slide, I can actually duplicate a view. So rather than create a new view, I can duplicate one. And I want to show you another alternative to this. So I have this thing inside of a tile. I'm going to get rid of the tile. So in the field list, you have this thing that says tile by. That was created when I created the tile. So I'm going to drag out that field, and the tile will go away. Now I just got the chart. I'm going to move this, and I'm going to create a different way of filtering that chart. And let me go and grab the diseases again. I'm going to grab the description of the disease. And then I'm going to say, make this a slicer. This is sort of like the slicers in Excel, if you've ever used those. And the big difference between this and a tile is a tile is more about navigation. It's not, it is doing filtering, but think of it as navigation. You're navigating one by one through the items. Whereas this, I could do that, but I could also select multiple things. So it's a more powerful filter. It doesn't have that metaphor of navigation. It's got a stronger metaphor of filtering. I can even create a slicer on an image. So I could have done that with the image as well. Just check the image and say create slicer. And it works the same way. Okay? While we're on the topic of filtering, if I go up to a chart like this and I just say show filters, I'm going to get the filter pane, which up until now has been hidden. Right? By default, it's hidden. But in the ribbon, there's this filters area button that toggles it. So it could be shown, it could be hidden. I can collapse it, I can expand it. Anytime I go to a visualization and I say show filters, it's going to expand it if it's not already expanded. Any fields that I'm already using in the visualization are going to show up on this chart type by default. What this means is these are the filters for this chart only, specific to this chart. So I could say, for example, gender, and filter this out to only the females, and you'll see it affect the chart. Right? This is also, by the way, how you could filter out blanks. I could select everything and then filter out the blanks. Now, that's one type of filter. If you look at a count of diagnosis, for example, this is a numeric value, so you're going to get a numeric slider. Right? You also have what we call advanced mode. So if I switch over to advanced mode, I can just do arbitrary conditions, equal to, greater than, all that sort of thing, and I can type these in. If I had a date field, you'd also see a calendar control in here as well. Aside from chart, there's also this thing called view. The difference with view is anything I put in here is going to filter not just this one chart, but everything on this one view. So the way I add something to this, by the way, is I just take age group, for example, or any field, and just drag it in. And then I'll get a filter card for it. Okay? And then I can filter by a certain age group. I want to create one more view because I want to show you one more visualization. So here what I want to do is I want to look at gender, and I want to look at weight, blood pressure, and weight. And the reason is that there's sort of a correlation between those two, or there's sort of a dependency between those two. And a really good way of testing for correlation or checking correlation is with a scatter chart. So here I've created a scatter chart. And scatter chart can incorporate up to 3 measures, one for each axis and also for the size of the bubble if you want to make it a bubble chart. So I might as well use that. Maybe I'll use the count of charts as the size, and I'll drag that over to size. And then I can even pull in one more thing, which is a play axis. So let's look at patient age and drag that down to play axis here. And it'll create this play axis on the chart, and now it will be an animated chart. So now I can run this and actually see how people's weight and blood pressure changes over essentially their lifespan. Right? I can click on these things and I will get traces of where they've been so far. I can control click and I'll get multiple traces and then go back and play this. And so, for example, I see that there's a big difference between women and men when they're younger in terms of both weight and blood pressure. But as I play it, I can see what happens, and an interesting thing plays out. The women catch up with the men in terms of blood pressure. Here they've almost caught up, right? Here they've actually surpassed them. So that's why they have all these campaigns about women and heart disease, thinking that it doesn't affect them, because the reality is that it does, right? So there's another type of blood pressure, just to give you an example of the sort of insights that this play axis can make jump out at you. And I can take, instead of the systolic blood pressure, which is one component of blood pressure, I can take this diastolic blood pressure and play out the exact same thing. Okay, so I'm going to just put some marker traces on here and play this out. And they've both started increasing, but the difference here is that the women don't catch up with the men. The other interesting difference here is that after a while, they start actually reversing, and they retrace their own steps. And here, by the time you hit around 86, you have the exact same weight and blood pressure as you had when you were 18. So I never would have thought that, but that's why a scatter chart with a play axis can be really cool. It can be really effective. So now I've created this cool report with all these different views in it, right? This is a sort of edit mode of Power View. When I'm sharing this with others, they might see something when they open it up more like this, which gets rid of the field lists and all that other stuff because they don't necessarily need it at this point. And they can just page through these different views. Right? They can even go to one at random and just pick one from this sort of film strip looking UI. And there's even a full screen mode. So in a sort of setting like this, the full screen mode is great. So I can go through these different views. Right? I still got the film strip. Now, it's great that we got these presentation capabilities, but imagine that I already have another presentation that I'm giving. This is just a part of it. I want to incorporate maybe one or two of these views into that presentation, or I'm planning to build out a presentation. My general purpose presentation tool is PowerPoint. So we built export to PowerPoint right into the product. I could just say export to PowerPoint. When I do that, the report needs to be saved, because what happens is the PowerPoint presentation points back to the report in SharePoint. So now I got to save the report. And you get our Save As dialog. And I'm just going to put this in the Power Pivot Gallery. Report 1, sure, call it that. Yes, I will paste the file. So now what it's going to do is it's going to go through the report and it's going to capture an image of exactly what I'm seeing at this time so that I can put those into the PowerPoint presentation. And when it's done, it's going to tell me that it's ready to save the presentation. And then I can put the presentation whenever I want, wherever I want. So I'll just put it in here. I'll call it or I'll just call it healthcare. Save that. Now it's saving the PowerPoint presentation. And now if I open that up, it's just a regular PowerPoint presentation. Right? It's got some images in it. There's no PowerPoint add-in or anything that I'm running, Power View add-in or anything that I'm running in PowerPoint. It's just a regular PowerPoint presentation. I see the image that I captured when I did the export. We'll see that come up here in a sec. But the other thing I can do is I can actually click this button that says Click to Interact. And then what's going to happen is it's going to load Power View inside PowerPoint. It's going to connect to SharePoint. So at this point, you do need connectivity. Up until now, just to view the image, you don't need connectivity. But at this point, you do. And it's going to load the report. It's going to run the queries. It's going to get fresh data. And then we can use the report just like we used it in the browser. So all the same sort of interactivity. I could, click on these, and I could run this. So this sort of stuff wasn't possible in PowerPoint before. So really cool capability now that you can build these interactive presentations in PowerPoint.
Question.
Yep.
Before you export it to PowerPoint, you have to save the Power Pivot.
The report, yeah.
Report, yeah. What happens if someone accidentally changes the report before I have my presentation? After I make my PowerPoint.
So the PowerPoint doesn't embed a copy of the report, so it can get out of sync with the report on the server.
The saved report is only needed when you create the PowerPoint and not when you use it.
No. It's always connecting back. When you're just looking at the image in PowerPoint, you don't need connectivity at that point. You don't even need the report on the server. But as soon as you click to interact, it's going to go and get the latest version, whatever's on the server. If it's been modified, it could get out of sync. And if it's been deleted, then it won't work. Okay. Question? It is, yeah. So PowerView is based on Silverlight. And here we are running the Silverlight basically as an ActiveX control inside of PowerPoint. Yes, to use PowerView either in the browser or in PowerPoint, you have to have Silverlight 5 installed. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to get back to, that pretty much wraps up the demo for the most part. I wanted to get back to slides just for a quick sec. Whenever we demo PowerView, especially for people who are newer to PowerView, they start asking, how does that fit in with the other reporting services technologies? I think I already covered a lot of that in the sense that I was talking about the history of reporting services and how you have these more traditional reports that are suited to pagination and printing and exporting. This is very much optimized for on the screen, right? We do have export to PowerPoint. We do have basic what you see is what you get printing, but there's a difference in emphasis there. And the other would be the target user. Right here, again, you can see PowerView is targeted at end users. Okay. Just a little bit, I don't want to go too deep on this, but just a little bit about the architecture here. I talked about the fact that reporting services and analysis services are all integrated into SharePoint now, going all the way from the web server, the web front end, including the app server as well. So it's not just a shallow integration, even the back end is integrated into SharePoint. So you've got the PowerView client here. What it's connecting to is it's connecting to the reporting services web server, the reporting services web front end, which is the add-in for SharePoint. There's no separate install for PowerView. You just basically install reporting services. You're going to need SQL Server BI Edition or SQL Server Enterprise Edition. It's not in Standard Edition, so you need BI Edition or higher. But if you install reporting services in one of those editions, in SharePoint mode, you're going to get PowerView. It's included in that install. It's not a separate component. That communicates with the backend, which is the reporting services service application. So there's a component you need to install on your app server. Now, these could be one tier. These could be one server if you don't have a scale-out environment. And then the actual querying, the way that works is you could be querying a workbook in SharePoint, in which case we're talking to another service in SharePoint, which is the Power Pivot System Service. Or we could be talking to an analysis services server outside of SharePoint. That's the scenario where I mentioned if you're going to use Windows authentication, you do need Kerberos to do that second hop. And then that queries a database. The database could operate in a cache mode where it's pulling the data sources from SQL Server or Oracle or whatever. Or it could be running in something called direct query mode, where it actually translates the queries that PowerView sends into SQL queries direct to SQL Server. There are some restrictions in that case. The model can only query one SQL Server database. Whereas if you use cache mode, you could pull in all kinds of data sources. Finally, I wanted to show you just some of the stuff in the model and how that works and how it drove that behavior. So this is my model. And it's just an Excel workbook. And I'm in Power Pivot here. And I've got all those tables. Remember, all the tables that we saw in the field list? Those are all of them here. They're just tables in Power Pivot. And one of the most fundamental things is just creating relationships. So I pulled in this region table and this state table. I can really easily create a relationship. Just right-click on the state, say Create Relationship. And you can just use that dialog. Pretty self-explanatory to say the related table is region. and its division name or something, or division number. So really easily create relationships. Calculated columns are another interesting thing. So here, for example, age wasn't in the original data set, but I just used a DAX calculation, you can see it there, to get their approximate age based on their year of birth. All I know is their year of birth, so it's going to be an approximate age. You can hide some of the fields from Power View. So here, I'm just using some fields for other calculations, or I'm using them to just create relationships. So you can say hide from client tools, and then they won't show up in Power View. To get some of the images, what I did was in my SQL Server database where some of this came from, I had just a var binary column that had the binary image data. And when you pull that into Power Pivot, it just becomes a binary column. And it's really that simple. There's nothing else to do. The hard part, of course, is getting the images in the SQL Server database or the relational database in the first place. But if you already have a database like that, then it's easy. If you don't, the other alternative that you have is you can use image URLs. So here, for example, for state, I just created a column and referenced state flags in Wikipedia. And then all I got to do is click on this and go to Advanced and say Image URL. By telling it that it's an image URL, Power View is going to treat it as an image. I showed some measures in the report. The way to create measures is using this measure grid below. Basically, you could just take any column here, for example, blood pressure, and say auto sum or average it or whatever. So I could say, for example, sum it. And then it created a calculation down here. And you can see the value. And I can edit the DAX expression for that. DAX expressions are basically Excel formulas. Right? It's an extension of Excel formulas. The other thing that was really critical that I showed was, how did it know to average a whole bunch of these things rather than sum them? Well, here if I go to Advanced, and I say Summarize By, I had chosen average, whereas the default would have been default, which would have been either don't summarize or sum. Right? Another thing was table behavior. So I have an ID, an identifier, or a primary key selected for this table, but I've also selected those rows which, wrong thing, default field set. Those rows which I thought were interesting and we should select by default, right? Where I just went before, table behavior, that's where I select my default label and my default image. So for example, if I go to the disease table and I say table behavior, you'll see that I chose the description and the image as my default label and my default image, and that's why that card looked nice. I think that is pretty much it. Did I cover everything? Let me just make sure. Oh, sort by other columns. So you may have noticed that when I showed the age groups, that the age groups were sorted. I think I still have my report open here. The age groups were sorted correctly, and I think in one case I even had an under 18 age group, which isn't showing up here. But it's not sorting those alphabetically. It knows how to sort those because in the Power Pivot workbook, I said that age group, this text description, shouldn't be sorted alphabetically. It should be sorted by the numeric value. You would often want to do this with, for example, names of months or names of days of the week, and you can easily do that by saying sort by other column. So here I can say the age group text should actually be sorted by the age value. Right. So there you go, just some tips and tricks of what you can do in your model. The value of DAX, I just showed some of the DAX expressions there. I showed how you can do counts or sum or averages or min and max in Power View just out of the box. More complex calculations you would currently need to do in the model. So by knowing DAX, and learning a little bit about DAX, you can do more complex calculations they could be as incrementally complex as adding two things together or doing string concatenation, or they could be more complex like doing statistical calculations and that sort of thing. So what I want you to take away from this, and what I hope that we've been able to show today, is Power View is part of reporting services, but it's a new experience within the reporting services platform. It's an interactive data exploration, visualization, and presentation experience. It arguably lets you create what we might call the next generation of presentations. We think of presentations today, and we think of maybe what I'm showing you right now, which is just a static slide deck. We really want to take presentations to the next level where you interact with the content, and it's a lot more dynamic. And by having interactive animated content in PowerPoint, that's one step towards that. To get the most out of PowerView, it's good to have an understanding of the model and basic concepts in the model and how you can tweak some of those settings to influence the behavior of PowerView. And if you really want to get fancy with your models, knowing a bit of DAX is certainly helpful. Finally, hopefully you got a sense of the fact that it's actually fun to use PowerView. Unlike, not everybody would have said that BI tools from years or decades ago are fun to interact with. They're tricky to interact with. So PowerView is pretty simple, and it makes it fun to just discover insights from the data. There was a question back there? Yeah. Okay, so the question was, if you export to PowerPoint, let me know if I got it correct. If you export to PowerPoint, you get these static images that are embedded within the PowerPoint presentation, and then you can also go live and interact. But over time, the static images may get out of date because the data may change. Is there a way to refresh those from within the PowerPoint presentation? Currently, there isn't. So what you have to do is re-export. So, but you can re-export. Yes. Sorry, I didn't catch that last part. Yeah. You may not. The order in the PowerPoint presentation may be different from the order in the report, right? But the way, if you need updated static images, you can simply re-export. And you're free to use regular PowerPoint functionality, like you can copy and paste those slides into your other presentation. HTML5? I knew somebody was going to ask about HTML5. So go to the Reporting Services team blog. It's you can just search for it. It's blogs.mstn.com/SQLRS team blog. But you can search for it and you'll find it. One of the posts in there was basically our roadmap for mobile BI. And it laid out a commitment of we want reporting services and PowerView to be on every screen, on every platform in some way, maybe to different levels of experience. But that includes things like Windows 8. That includes things like the iPad. That includes other things that may not be top-tier priorities for us, but that we want them to render in the mobile browser, right? So there are a number of ways that we can do that. Obviously, you have native apps like Metro-style apps on Windows 8. You have native iPad apps. You have HTML5 if you want to go that route. So all we've said at this point is that it's going to work. We're going to invest in that. We're going to make it work on these devices. The actual technology choices is not something that we've disclosed. So it's well possible that we may have an HTML5 implementation. It's possible that we won't. It's possible that we'll have HTML5 and native apps. So the actual technology choices has not been disclosed yet. But the commitment to having it run on the mobile devices is there. Yeah. So I just want to get through this really quickly, and I'll see if we can take any more questions. Some other resources. Again, I mentioned the Reporting Services team blog, SQL RS team blog. There are some public-facing demos when you get the slide deck if you want to try out PowerView without having to install anything. Some related sessions that you might want to go to. Casper de Jong, who's on the Analysis Services team, is doing a couple of sessions this morning. One is all about DAX, if you want to learn about DAX. The other one is called Building the Perfect BI Semantic Tabular Models for PowerView, which is really good if you want to learn more about that model, that metadata, because I didn't show everything. Finally, not sure how many people went to my session yesterday, which was somewhat similar to this one, but it was about tips and tricks for building traditional reporting services reports. That one was full, and apparently they got a request from a bunch of people to repeat it, so they're repeating it again today at 1 o'clock if you want to go to that. Just some other resources for you, standard stuff. We have all our docs on MSDN, on TechNet. Hopefully they'll have some certification courses for this stuff as well. I want to encourage you, if you go by the expo hall, we're doing a survey for Microsoft BI. We want to learn who's using Microsoft BI, what's your job, what do you do, what do you use it for, what do you not use it for. This is going to help us prioritize the next versions of the product. Finally, please complete an evaluation, because we want to make these sessions better and better and continuously improve them. So if you can take a few minutes to complete an evaluation, you can scan that on your mobile device, or you can just go to the TechEd site and do it from there. Okay, I think I'm out of time. I'm not sure when this next session starts. Do I have some time to take questions? Okay, well, I don't see anybody else kicking me off, so I'll take a few questions if you have any. Yep.
The cover scheme might be kind of tiny thing, but how can I get this in line with corporate UI guidelines? I mean, you have templates for PowerPoint and everything.
Right. Right. Yeah.
It doesn't match with the Office colors. It doesn't match with the reporting service colors. How do you get it?
Right. So the question was about how do we customize the colors for charts and things like that so that they match a corporate style guideline or branding guideline. Unfortunately, I hear you, but you can't do that right now. We only have these built-in themes. So it's definitely something that's on our list of things that we know we want to address, especially as we think about what are the requirements for Power View being used potentially in a more enterprise scenario or by other types of target audiences, including BI professionals who have stricter requirements in many cases. So it's not there right now, but it's definitely a known issue. Yep. We do not have pie chart in the current release. Like I said, when we basically finished work on SQL Server 2012, we immediately continued working on the next release. So, and the next release, I don't necessarily even mean major release. We haven't disclosed what the next release vehicle is. We started working on the next batch of features before we knew what our next release vehicle was. So we have a bunch of features that we've developed that are going to go into some future release vehicle, hopefully sooner rather than later. So all I would say about that is stay tuned, because the next wave does include some new visualizations. Yep. I wish I could. Unfortunately, we are not able to disclose anything about what the next release vehicle is, when it's coming, or what's in it. All I can tell you is I can acknowledge whether something is something we've heard before, something on our list, how high of a priority it is for us, how much we've thought about it. Yeah. Yep. Yes. So the reason it doesn't work with multidimensional cubes, you cannot use Power View today against an existing multidimensional cube, is because Power View sends DAX as its query language rather than MDX. So whereas Excel sends MDX, for example. So Excel works with cubes because it sends MDX. Currently, Analysis Services does not support DAX queries against cubes. However, the vision for BI Semantic Model, which has these multidimensional and tabular flavors, is that they're supposed to be interchangeable and sort of symmetric. You can query tabular with DAX and multidimensional with MDX, just the typical case, or you can interchange them. You can query multidimensional with DAX, and you can query tabular with MDX. 3 of those 4 scenarios are working today. The one that we need to get working is DAX queries over cubes, and that just wasn't ready for SQL Server 2012. However, the Analysis Services team made a commitment quite a while ago, when SQL Server 2012 was released, that although it wasn't in that release, they would commit to doing it to complete the end-to-end scenario, and that it would be available before the next release of SQL Server. So you do not have to wait until, before the next major release of SQL Server. You do not have to wait another full major release cycle. Okay. Anybody else? Yep.
Is it always reliant on SharePoint to create and edit new reports?
Currently, yes. Currently, the only incarnation of Power View is as a web app within SharePoint. We may see it surface in other places down the road. We're looking at that, so I would stay tuned. Yep. So yes and no. Mostly no. We do not have a web part, a Power View web part, like we have a Report Viewer web part. So we have a Report Viewer web part that's specific to showing reporting services reports, and it's got some reporting services aligned features in it. Power View, we don't have a web part yet specifically for it. However, what you can do, technically you can embed it within a web part page. You can use either the page viewer web part, which is basically an iframe, and then we have some URL parameters, which are not yet documented, but that I hope will be documented soon, which control the appearance of the shell. So like you can hide, you probably don't want to show the ribbon, you may want to make the background color white or something. So we have some parameters to tweak that. The other one you can use is the Silverlight web part, which would do it as well. It's a little trickier to use, but it is possible. So the caveat of that, again, would be that it's a little trickier to use, and also it doesn't respond to web part connections. So if you put a SharePoint filter or something on the page, it's not going to respond to the filter. There's no way to connect them together.
Do you want to address it in future?
We do, yes, definitely. Yeah, we've had several requests for that. Yep.
Minimal license requirements.
Yes.
Is SQL Server Enterprise or the I edition,
Yes.
SharePoint Foundation, or Standard edition? SharePoint
Yes.
Foundation is enough.
Here's where that gets tricky. So you're asking about the SharePoint SKU. With SQL Server, it is definitely a licensing requirement. We actually have code to block it from working in SQL Server Standard. It's disabled in SQL Server Standard. It will not work. We have no such code to block you from using it in SharePoint Foundation or SharePoint Server Standard. However, really the priority for us is the end-to-end scenario of getting a full BI environment up and running. And Power Pivot, we sort of depend on Power Pivot for a good 50% of our scenarios. And Power Pivot in turn depends on Excel services, which depends on Secure Store, all these interrelated, interdependent services that in turn depend on SharePoint Enterprise. So really to get the complete BI environment, you need SharePoint Enterprise. For that reason, SharePoint Enterprise is all we test with and all we officially support. However, to answer your question most accurately, technically if you run it on SharePoint Foundation, there would be no code to stop it from working. Right. Just to add one point to that, I know somebody has asked in the past about this. When do you need a SharePoint eCal? Definitely talk to the licensing people about this, but what I do know is that basically you can install or turn on SharePoint Enterprise features. Right? As soon as you do that, you do need an eCal. So if you're going to turn on Power Pivot or anything like that, you do need an eCal. Any other questions? Nope. Well, thank you very much for attending. I hope it was valuable. If you have any questions, I'll hang around for a little bit and you can ask me any additional questions. Okay, thanks. Enjoy the rest of the day.